Good morning. As Catherine says, my name is Paul Jones. I'm a professor of American literature in the Department of English at Ohio University. And it's such a pleasure this morning to welcome today's keynote speaker, Melissa Homestead, professor of English and program faculty in Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Melissa is a scholar whose work I have admired and whose friendship and collegiality I have cherished for many years. I believe we initially met at a conference on American women's writing about 20 years ago, but I may be misremembering. But I'm certain that I was already familiar with her work before this meeting because of the articles that would become chapters in her first book, American Women Authors and Literary Property, 1822 to 1869, which was published by Cambridge in 2006. This book explored women writers, including Harriet Beecher Stowe, Catherine Sedgwick, and Augusta Jane Evans, and their complicated navigation of copyright laws during their careers. This book is just one product of Melissa's career-long investment in American women's literary history, which has led her to produce a lengthy list of articles, book chapters, editions, and essay collections, almost exclusively, or maybe exclusively, on female American authors, ranging from 18th century writer Susanna Rowson to 19th century figures like Sedgwick, Stowe, Evans, E.D. Ian Southworth, and Sarah Orne Jewett, and into the 20th century with Willa, Cather. It is Melissa Homestead's extensive work on Midwesterner Cather that is most relevant to this meeting, though I know the question of who, what, or where is Midwestern is passionately debated among this group. Melissa's scholarly attention to Cather, the author of such well-known novels as My Antonia, O Pioneers, and Death Comes for the Archbishop, began when she wrote an undergraduate honors thesis on Cather at Smith College, and has continued through her current position at Nebraska, where she is director of the Cather Project, co-editor of the In Progress, The Complete Letters of Willa Cather, and co-director of a digital library of Willa Cather's literary manuscripts to be published in 2026. Her study of Cather's life and work has resulted in her most recent book, The Only Wonderful Things, The Creative Partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, published by Oxford in 2021. This work makes an essential contribution to Cather studies as it offers an account of the partnership, both romantic, domestic, and artistic, between Cather and magazine editor and copywriter Edith Lewis. It meticulously chronicles Cather and Lewis's over 40-year-long relationship, and importantly shows that Lewis had a significant role as an editor and editor of and a literary collaborator in Cather's published work. It truly is a must-read for any student or fan of Cather, and perhaps most recently, Melissa's attachment to Cather has led her to a couple of Cather-themed tattoos, which I'm sure she'll be willing to show off to the curious. And finally, as some of you have likely heard in your conversations with Melissa over the last day or so, she is gleefully looking forward to her upcoming retirement, where she plans to settle back into her favorite city, Philadelphia, and to begin work on a new project, a dual biography of another lesbian literary power couple, Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Adams Fields. Join me in welcoming Melissa Homestead to the podium this morning.
As Paul said, my most recent book was about Cather's partnership with Edith Lewis. And just to say a little bit as a prologue, Cather and Lewis did not leave behind a body of correspondence. The letter-burning myths about Cather have no true basis in any documented fact. And so those letters might be somewhere, or they might have been destroyed by somebody else. But also, in my research, I spent a lot of time in more recent archives. Edith Lewis died in 1972, so it was very strange for me to work on somebody who was alive when I was alive. I was born in 1963. And in these archives, I found about 600 Edith Lewis letters, none to Willa Cather, the overwhelming majority from after Cather's death. And at some point, I thought there would be a lot more of this archive in my book. And there is a final chapter which is about the Cold War and uses some of these materials, but there was just so much more going on. And so this project, in some ways, is using those materials to tell a different story in which Cather is not a living figure. So here we go. In the summer of, okay, now we're going with the slow down here. See, we just tested it and now it doesn't want to do it. There we go. In the summer of 1979, Bruce Bennett, it's going to get a little confusing because he's B-E-N-I-D-T, and then there's someone who's B-E-N-N-E-T-T. Bruce Bennett, a young reporter with the Minneapolis Star, traveled to Webster County, Nebraska, to write about Willa Cather and the sites associated with her life and works there. In his 4-page, lavishly illustrated Sunday magazine story, Bennett lyrically celebrated as a novelist of the pioneering, Cather as a novelist of the pioneering era on the Great Plains. He called pioneering our heritage, implicitly signaling that to his readers that they were descended from the same Eastern U.S. migrants and European immigrants depicted in Cather's novels. He was also concerned with Cather as a person and the Willa Cather Pioneer Memorial, founded in 1959 and designed to attract literary pilgrims to Webster County. While conceding that Cather had a mannish image and there were phases of her life where she cut her hair very short and wore unfeminine dress, and that's one of the famous pictures there in a sort of newspaper reproduction, Bennett reported on his conversation with Professor Bernice Sloat of the University of Nebraska, who assured him that the image has been overemphasized and that Cather was feminine but had to dress comfortably but simply and had to be aggressive because she was in a business in a man's world. Sloat also characterized Cather's unmarried state as in line with her focus on her career. Mildred Bennett, who was the moving force behind the founding of the Willa Cather Pioneer Memorial, put a distinctly regional spin on Cather's unmarried status in her conversation with Bennett, although she also characterized Cather's choice not to marry in terms of her career ambitions. She would not marry a man she couldn't look up to, and she would not marry a man who would dominate her. She also remarked, "If you're in the East, they'll tell you she was a lesbian." And maybe she was. I don't know how anybody is ever going to prove it. Bruce Bennett soon received an irate phone call from Charles Cather, a California lawyer and oilman who was Willa Cather's nephew. He had succeeded to the role of his aunt's literary executor after the death in 1972 of Edith Lewis, and they were Cather and Lewis in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, with whom Cather had lived for nearly 40 years in New York City. As Bruce Bennett reported to Mildred Bennett, he was very upset at the quote about Cather's possible lesbianism, and he and Charles Cather had a long and interesting discussion about historical inquiry and the rights of privacy and so on. I was glad he called, and although I do believe it important to take a full look at a historical or literary figure, I think I had known how strongly he would object to that passage. I might have left it out. He is, or sounds like, a quite conservative man, and felt that this was a sign of how bad the times have become. He said it was completely untrue, but as you said, how can anyone know or prove? Bruce Bennett also reported that he had suggested to Charles Cather that he might write a rebuttal for publication, but Charles Cather preferred not to bring the matter up again. The Cold War still lingered in 1979. I was in high school, I remember. It was also, however, a decade after the Stonewall Uprising of 1969, often characterized as the beginning of the modern gay rights movement. This is the context, perhaps, for Charles Cather's sense of how bad the times have become. The origins of this moment of conflict, however, had their origins in the 1950s, when Bennett founded the Willa Cather Pioneer Memorial and confronted questions of gender and sexuality in Memorializing, the author who had chronicled Webster County in her fiction. Mildred Bennett and her family moved to Red Cloud in 1946, before Cather's death. Bennett had an undergraduate degree in English and Spanish from Union College, a Seventh-day Adventist institution in Lincoln, and a master's degree in psychology from the University of Nebraska. Her husband, Wilbur, was a physician, and a nurse, Marietta Bush, soon joined their household in Red Cloud. Something going on there. There'll be a little more about that soon. Mildred Bennett was not, at the time that they moved to Red Cloud, interested in pursuing preservation of sites associated with Cather and her novels. Rather, her ambitions were literary. As she later told Bruce Bennett, when she was a college student, a professor told her, the first person to write a book about Willa Cather after her death would make a substantial contribution to literature. And there were lots of people, as soon as Cather's death notice appeared in the New York Times, I can't tell you how many letters went to the Knopf Publishing concern asking about whether they could be the authorized biographer. With the aid of Carrie Miner Sherwood, one of Cather's childhood friends, Mildred Bennett began gathering information for a biography even before Cather died in 1947. Shortly after Cather died, she made her first attempt to expand her research beyond Red Cloud by traveling to California to interview the musical Menuhin family at their ranch. Violinist Yehudi Menuhin was the best-known member of the family, but Cather and Lewis had befriended the whole family, including his talented sisters Yalta and Hepzibah, in the 1930s. However, the matriarch of the family, Marutha, when she received a letter from Bennett asking to visit, asked Lewis whether or not she should speak to Bennett. Lewis, who had been appointed literary executor in Cather's will, told her not to. Lewis knew that she couldn't prevent Bennett from writing a book about Cather, but she also felt no obligation to help her when she would soon authorize Professor E.K. Brown as a biographer. Foiled in her attempt to write a true biography, Bennett instead wrote and published The World of Willa Cather, an anecdotal and photographically illustrated book focusing primarily on Cather's Nebraska years. In contrast, E.K. Brown produced a critical biography. We're one behind, sorry. E.K. Brown published a critical biography and focused more on Cather's work, and the book had no illustrations. As a result, it was Bennett who first brought to public attention the since widely circulated images of Cather as a gender nonconforming adolescent who used the name William, sometimes styled William Cather, MD. In multiple studio portraits beginning in 1886 and through 1892, Cather's hair was cropped short in a variety of short masculine styles, with the sides tight and with the bangs forward to the side or slicked back in a pompadour. So we'll have some here. Here is the bangs forward. Here she is, or they. I mean, this question of Cather's gender is one that I'm still trying to figure out how to navigate. And they're with Louise Pound at the university. And here we have the pompadour. Although Cather is often described as wearing boys' or men's clothing during this period, the clothing is not fussy or femme, but it's clearly girls' or women's clothing. The shoulders of shirts and jackets are pleated and puffed, as you can see there. And neckties like that were not exclusively masculine attire in the 1890s. The only exceptions are photographs of Cather playing male roles in theatrical productions, so breeches parts. Indeed, in The World of Willa Cather, in a chapter that was titled Drama, Bennett glossed the non-theatrical images in terms of performance. The chapter begins by recounting Cather's roles in plays put on in Red Cloud and in her high school graduation oration. Several years before her graduation from high school, Bennett wrote, Willa Cather began to play a continuous role that lasted into her second year at the university. Claiming that Cather first cut her hair short because of her mother's postpartum illness, she elaborates, at the same time she was planning to become a surgeon and she wished to dress the part, she affected the character of a boy wearing a jacket, a derby hat or cap, and a white shirt, and she carried a cane. She also described how Cather continued to wear her hair short in masculine styles for the first 2 years at the university, but was persuaded by friends in Lincoln to grow her hair out. So here she is in a theatrical production. You see her hair is long enough for a bun. At the time The World of Willa Cather appeared in 1951, what historian David Johnson calls the Lavender Scare was in full flower. He says, with the nation on moral alert because of the Cold War, he explains, monogamous heterosexual marriages were seen as a key weapon in the arsenal against degeneracy and internal communist subversion. Notably, Kenneth Wherry, a conservative Republican U.S. Senator from Nebraska, was a moving force behind efforts to purge gay men and lesbians from the federal government. As he asked on the Senate floor in 1950, can you think of a person who could be more dangerous to the United States of America than a pervert? As Mildred Bennett would later describe it, her efforts to found the WCPM grew out of her research for the world of Willa Cather. As she told the Minneapolis Star in 1979, the interview she did for the book convinced her of the need to preserve historic sites in and around Red Cloud that had played a part in Cather's life and writing. I'm going to say here that I'm on the Board of Governors, what's now called the National Willa Cather Center, and although there's deep homophobia in this 1950s material, the National Willa Cather Center is now forthright in reckoning with Cather's sexuality. So just want to make clear that, I mean, although when I first went to a Cather conference in 1993, it was still hella homophobic, but that has really changed. Scholars have made a case for reading Cather's adolescent nonconformity through the lens of trans identity and practices. And perhaps in Q&A, I can say more about how reading Jen Mannion's book, Female Husbands, A Trans History, has shifted my thinking about Cather and trans history. In any event, in the 1950s, when Bennett recovered photos such as this, I believe they would have been read in terms of butch lesbian identity. So how did the Willa Cather Pioneer Memorial navigate this lesbian possibility in memorializing the dead author? Its organizational records from its early years are sparse, and in its first decade, the WCPM was too much of a shoestring, seat-of-the-pants operation to have a properly developed interpretive program. Instead, the organization relied on donations of both objects and money, the latter particularly from Cather family members, making its physical displays in its museum a sort of hodgepodge. These exhibits included everything from genuine Cather-related materials, so here is a writing desk that belonged to Cather, to crude dioramas representing scenes in Cather's fiction, and this is from The Sculptor's Funeral. In 1993, they still had this kind of stored semi-on display in the basement of their offices then, to specimens of taxidermy. Here's the taxidermy. That the name included the phrase Pioneer Memorial gestured to a broader project of memorialization. Like Bennett's The World of Willa Cather, which includes many anecdotes about the pioneer era that have only tangential or even no relationship to Cather in her works, the WCPM celebrated the pioneer era as much as it celebrated the dead author. It thus performed cultural work akin to the statues that Cynthia Culver Prescott analyzes in Pioneer Mother Monuments, Constructing Cultural Memory, which I read and put into this paper before I knew she was also going to be giving a keynote at this conference. There are some key differences, however. First, the WCPM did not have the financial resources to commission and erect the sort of monumental bronzes that Prescott analyzes. And second, while these monumental bronzes commemorated the movement of Anglo-American white women west during the pioneer era, the key figure for the WCPM was Annie Sedilek-Pavelka, an Eastern European immigrant from Bohemia, now part of the Czech Republic, who served as the prototype for the title character of Cather's 1918 novel, My Antonia. Even before the founding of the WCPM, Annie was central to a 1951 Life magazine story that Bennett had pitched to the magazine, and which became part of an effort to promote the world of Willa Cather. Now 82, a photo caption touted, Annie Pavelka of Bladen, Nebraska, Willa's lifelong friend and inspiration for My Antonia, still has what the writer called the full vigor of her personality, battered but not diminished of her youth. And that's actually kind of quasi-quoting the end of My Antonia. The accompanying body text, like the photo caption, conflates the fiction and the fact, which is a danger of going out to Catherland. You know, people will say things like, actually, Annie Pavelka's granddaughter would tell you, and she only died a couple of years ago, I'm My Antonia's granddaughter. And you have to think, no, you're not a granddaughter of a fictional character. But the accompanying body text, like the photo caption, conflates fiction and fact. The farm wife and mother of 13, readers were told, The farm wife and mother of 13 readers were told, to her friend Willa Cather, Annie was all her life the symbol of the conquest of the New World by pioneers from the Old. Edith Lewis was actually kind of distressed at this article because she felt like Annie was being sort of demeaned and exploited. In both Cather's novel and in the life of Annie, an extramarital pregnancy before her marriage to a Czech immigrant farmer was a key life event. Furthermore, when Bennett started her research by interviewing Cather's childhood friend, Carrie Minor Sherwood, who also served as a prototype for a character in My Antonia, she learned of an even earlier extramarital pregnancy, the result of rape by a privileged Anglo-American young man in Red Cloud. With the aid of Carrie's father, Charles Minor, Annie sued her rapist for bastardy, although the suit had to be dropped when the child died in infancy. Notably, neither extramarital pregnancy figures in the World of Willa Cather or the Life magazine article promoting it. Readers of both who had not known the novel might have presumed that all of Annie's 13 children who survived infancy were the result of her monogamous heterosexual marriage to Anton Pavelka. One of the pictures of the adolescent Willa Cather appeared in the article as well, but it's dwarfed by the prominence given to Annie. A rare photograph documenting visitors to an exhibit at the WCPM suggests that the messaging of exhibits followed a similar script to the Life magazine article. The photograph shows Carrie Sherwood standing in front of an exhibit dedicated to Cather's works, talking to what appears to be a nuclear family consisting of a wife, husband, and 5 children. My Antonia, a handwritten motto at the top of the exhibit board, says, "Immigrant girls' courageous struggle to become an American on the frontier." In its early branding of itself, the WCPM also foregrounded Annie Sedilek-Pavelka as an immigrant pioneer woman. Cather had worked closely with Polish-American artist W.T. Benda on the pen and ink line drawings commissioned to illustrate My Antonia, including an image of adolescent Antonia at the plow. So here are the images. This is Antonia and Jim Burden, the narrator. This is Antonia when she's pregnant. She's sort of quasi-hiding her pregnancy, wearing a man's coat. This is the one I have tattooed on my forearm. This is Lena Lingard knitting. And there is Antonia at the plow. Let's see, where am I? When Carrie Sherwood created pen and ink designs to be used as part of the masthead for the early WCPM newsletters and for certificates to be awarded to affiliated Willa Cather societies, she evoked Benda's illustration. There is no William Cather, MD, represented here. Instead, the pioneer woman at her plow has central prominence. To return to the complaints of Willa Cather's nephew about the suggestion that at least Easterners might call Cather a lesbian, Mildred Bennett had broken a key rule about the WCPM and Cather during the Cold War era. Although that Cather was, or might have been a lesbian, was widely presumed. It functioned as an open secret. As Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick argues in The Epistemology of the Closet, the open secret structure of literary history entails questions about the homosexuality of authors being answered, "Don't ask, you shouldn't know." Whether or not Bruce Bennett, spurred by pictures of the masculine adolescent Cather recovered by Mildred Bennett, asked about Cather's sexuality when he visited Red Cloud, Bennett broke the open secret rule by stating publicly what was regularly said in letters and likely an in-person conversation. Just before the organizing efforts for the WCPM went public, Mildred Bennett's family generated its own open secret that violated Cold War norms. Recall that a nurse, Marietta Bush, lived in the Bennett household with Mildred, Wilbur, and their son. When The World of Willa Cather was published, Bennett celebrated Bush's support of the endeavor by taking on household chores and childcare so that Bennett could write. In January 1955, when Bush was, it seems, 3 months pregnant, she traveled to St. Paul, Nebraska to marry James F. Blue, a 41-year-old merchant from Washington, who then vanished, never to be mentioned in Nebraska newspapers again. Mildred Bennett went with Marietta to serve as a witness. In June, Marietta Blue, so that's 6 months after the marriage, Marietta Blue gave birth to Alicia Blue at Mary Lanning Hospital in Hastings, and life carried on. with Marietta and Alicia Blue living in the Bennett household, and Marietta supporting the work of the WCPM until her death shortly before her daughter's 18th birthday. The later traces of this, it's like, you know, by the time Bennett dies, Marietta is just described as her daughter. She's described as Wilbur's sister when he gets married. So, yeah, I mean, exactly what was going on. I mean, I first heard about this through sort of, you know, people talking like town gossip, which gave a very different version, like he brought her to, that Wilbur brought her, you know, as his mistress to town. That doesn't seem quite true, but I think there's definitely sort of an interesting story that we will never quite unpack. During its first decades, the WCPM was very much driven by Bennett personally and by Cather enthusiasts whom she befriended and then brought into the WCPM as members of its Board of Governors. With her inner circle, she carried on extensive correspondence, including about Cather's sexuality. A key correspondent was L.V. Leo Vincent Jacks, a classics professor at Creighton University in Omaha, who also taught creative writing and published trade books and articles in trade venues. Bennett had met him when she attended the Nebraska Writers' Conference, and he was a key advisor as she was researching and writing The World of Willa Cather. I mean, their correspondence is very much about her ambition, like that she really wanted to publish a novel, and she failed to place those, but this was kind of going to be the way she was going to make herself. In 1949, Bennett was also trying to build a relationship with Louise Pound, an English professor at the University of Nebraska who specialized in folklore and who had been Cather's university classmate and the object of her intense crush. One of those pictures I showed you a bit ago was her with Louise Pound. This crush is evident in Cather's letters to Pound during their shared university years. Pound clearly did not share these letters with Bennett, however, and after Pound's death, they went to Duke University Special Collections with access restrictions placed on them by her sister Olivia. And then they eventually were open to research. In any event, Bennett wrote to Jacks about her initial conversations with Pound in a letter not extant, and Jacks responded, "I think you have Pound sized up about right." Oops. Oh, here we go again. All right. I think you have Pound sized up about right. She is the old maid type, crabbed and perhaps a little jealous of Willa's success. It may be that she was the original source of the tale about Willa being queer. She probably never said that in so many words, but hinted at it, and if confronted, would say she never told such a story. It would be hard, if not impossible, to trace it home to her. She might be worth watching along those lines. In the end, Bennett gave up on Pound and didn't even mention her in The World of Willa Cather. In 1957, Bennett first met Virginia Faulkner, who at the time had just joined the staff of the University of Nebraska Press. Born and raised in Lincoln, Faulkner had a colorful and notably queer life in the East as a journalist, playwright, and novelist. She developed her own interest in Cather's life before returning to Nebraska, reading all of the published biographical accounts of Cather closely and applying a Jungian lens as she sought out the truth of Cather's sexuality. She had all these crazy notes where she color-coded everything by Jungian themes. They're in her papers at the University of Nebraska. Around 1957, she had approached Mildred Bennett about a collaboration. As Jacks wrote in response to Bennett's report on meeting Faulkner, "I think I would make some cautious overtures towards the family first and see how they feel. It would certainly have to be done tactfully. Still, Willa was an oddity in several ways, and of course it is no secret anywhere that some people are puzzled as to just what kind of sex equipment she had. Miss Faulkner may have material that would be of immense value. I think if I were you, I would try first to read it and evaluate it a bit, and then you can decide better if you want to have a hand. I do not have any doubt that sooner or later, someone will write a book about her on strictly psychological lines, and if you got in the first blow, it might be a good thing. Of course, if it is a co-authorship affair, you could, if you wish, confine your part to general history and let Miss Faulkner take the psychology." There is a long history of a whispered tradition in Red Cloud and Webster County using a garbled version of the word hermaphrodite to categorize Cather. I actually sat next to someone on a plane about 5 or 6 years ago who lived on a farm just across the way in Kansas who told me she had heard that. These rumors have no basis in fact. I think there is no reason to believe that Cather was intersex. Rather, they were an indirect way for people to talk about Cather's gender nonconformity and sexuality. Another letter from Jax to Mildred Bennett in 1961, is more direct about sexuality, about why using the label in relation to Cather was to be avoided. WC and the problem of homosexuality is a sticker. For my part, if it is not absolutely necessary, I feel I would shy off. On the other hand, if the problem is real and some squirt, like English professor John Randall, plunges into it, there will be more harm than good. Well, you could go back and read the memoirs of Hadrian, which are a 1951 novel by Marguerite Yourcenar, presented as an autobiography of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, including his love for Antinous. The French are really very slick at that. The basic question is, can any real evidence be uncovered? I venture to say no. Not that it might not have happened. I'm not enough of an authority to know anything about it, but just because Willie was shrewd and probably played them close to her chest if she had any. So it's going to be very hard to prove anything, and if you can prove something, there's not much gain by going into it, especially if it is a smelly subject. All of this is like, Edith Lewis is there, everybody knows she's there, but she's totally invisible. She lived with a woman for 40 years, and they're like, how can you prove she's a lesbian? Anyway, that's why I became fascinated by this. This letter suggests that Bennett was thinking of writing something about Cather's sexuality rather than making it the center of interpretive work at the WCPM. Nevertheless, Bennett and the enterprise she helped found were inextricably linked, and she continued to pursue the smelly subject, at least in private correspondence. Don Connors, an Omaha high school English teacher who moved to California, became part of Bennett's circle a decade after Jax did. Connors also corresponded with Bennett about Cather's sexuality. When Bennett was writing an article about cruelty in Cather's fiction, she wrote to Connors in 1962, "What do you think of sadism in its ramifications? I think Willa had a good streak of it in her. How does it tie in with other possibilities? She was cruel because she got a certain satisfaction out of it." In a follow-up letter on her thinking on the same article, Bennett implicitly invoked Freudian views of homosexuality, noting that Cather had a strong relationship with her father, but a tempestuous relationship with her mother. She mused, "For a woman who loves her father and hates her mother, why is the homosexual life attractive? Is it looking for a mother? Being unable to substitute another man, the father's plate? What is the mechanism, do you think?" John March, a senior editor at Collier's Encyclopedia, commissioned Bennett to write an article for the encyclopedia, leading to an extensive correspondence and friendship in March's service to the WCPM Board of Governors. March also corresponded with Virginia Faulkner, who commissioned him to index Cather titles for the University of Nebraska Press, and relied on him to carry out Cather-related research tasks in New York City. Bennett, Faulkner, and March often refer to one another in correspondence, including implicitly to their shared interest in deciphering Cather's sexuality. In 1962, for example, March wrote to Faulkner, "Mildred has told me your theory on the intralinear story in Sargent's book," and this is basically like read between the lines, "and I pored over it like crazy, but I couldn't find it." So Elizabeth Shepley Sargent was one of Cather's biographers. "You'll have to show me how to trace it. It is no doubt there because S is a rabid Jungian. Why don't you do an introduction and point this all out? It needs to be done. I would like that much." Although by this time, Bennett and Sargent had abandoned the idea of collaborating on a book about Cather, the work Faulkner had done before moving back to Nebraska to decode Cather's sexuality based on published biographical accounts of her was still live in conversations and correspondence. March's most explicit commentary on Cather's sexuality is an undated fragment of a letter to Bennett. Considering its references to Edith Lewis in the present tense and the perception that Lewis was obstructing Bennett's efforts in relation to Cather, it's likely from the 1950s or 1960s. He protested to Bennett, "Apparently the idea that Cather was a lesbian is gaining momentum, and I expect Lewis et al. Is helping it along. Twice lately, I have been asked that question, once by a would-be novelist who admires her very much. Now I get a letter from Paul Riley in Lincoln, he was the Nebraska State Historical Society, saying the question is being kicked around there by the big boys. In both cases, I have said I do not believe so. I don't. For sure, she has avoided anything that looks like a sex situation in her writings except for O Pioneers. She avoided it because she didn't know anything about it. I am sure, let's see, I am sure she never had any kind of sex experience. From her analysis of men-women relationships, I'd say her reactions were perfectly normal. That she never broke over is her business. I do not believe there ever was any overt relation on her part. There would be some suggestion of it in her writing. For my meager knowledge, I never saw anything I recognized as lesbianism in anything that she wrote. From what you have told me, I'd say that the Lewis-Cather relationship was not a happy one. I think Lewis realized C was a genius and wanted the glory. Otherwise, why so jealous? It was her only claim to fame. Cather hung on to her as Lewis was a buffer and took the knocks. Why else was Lewis such a bitch? This letter has haunted me since I first read it, like more than a decade ago. I expect C did most anything to keep her in that position. The whole thing was not normal, and I believe C would have developed differently had she married and had children. I believe all of the instincts were there. At least they show for me in her writings. No two people can deny the world and live as they did and have anything more than detriment. Cather was afraid, and part of her inspiration arose from that fear. It became a vicarious experience. How wrong am I? The way people here in New York brand everyone lesbian or homosexual, Cather wouldn't have escaped if people who knew had ever suspected anything. Lewis and her actions have led to it. It's no one's business but Cather's, only it has had an effect on her writing. The whole mess will be aired out someday. I hope whoever undertakes it is sympathetic and honest. If the gossip gains in volume, some bright psychoanalyst will open up the situation in a good Freudian manner. I rather hate to see it happen. No matter what they find, I feel we have the best of Cather without dissecting her too. So this letter, I said, has haunted me since I first read it, especially because I suspect that John March was a gay man, an older gay man, born in 1904, living in the city during the Cold War. But it also returns us to my opening vignette of the 1979 Minneapolis Star article and the sense expressed by Mildred Bennett that homosexuality is a coastal urban phenomenon. Similarly, and at an earlier date, people in New York City were asking March if Cather was a lesbian because that's a thing people in New York City would ask, because that's where all the queers were. And is where Cather herself spent most of her adult life. This is the idea that has become in scholarship on queer theory is called metronormativity, the idea that queer urban cultures are normal for queer, right? There was also the threat, however, of Nebraska taking the idea seriously. The big boys at the Nebraska State Historical Society also thought it was true. And March, who was born and raised in Oklahoma and earned 2 degrees at the University of Oklahoma, before moving to New York to earn a library degree from Columbia and taking a position at Collier's, found that idea threatening. Whether or not March was gay, identifying Cather as lesbian represented a threat, excuse me, to Virginia Faulkner in her work at the University of Nebraska Press, and to her partner, Bernice Sloat, quoted in the Minneapolis Star explaining away Cather's nonconformity more discreetly than Mildred Bennett did. I mean, there's actually a current biographer working on a biography of Virginia Faulkner, and he's like, I can't know if Bernice Sloat was a lesbian. I mean, Virginia Faulkner was, but I mean, it's like, what? Some of those things, I'm not a lesbian, but my girlfriend is. I mean, anyway. But Bernice and Virginia were clearly a couple, let's just say that. And all of them, ironically, were incapable of identifying Edith Lewis as Cather's partner, perhaps because Lewis never hid her relationship with Cather, either before or after her death. Living in the era of the Lavender Scare, they could only imagine Cather's sexuality as a secret. As L.V. Jacks wrote to Mildred Bennett in late 1949 to encourage her to continue after the world of Willa Cather had been rejected by the publisher Doubleday, Stick strongly to your position as a champion of the best woman writer, probably the best writer that Nebraska has ever produced. A little of the flag waving is called for now and then. Nebraska ought to be proud of Willa Cather. She was a fine woman, courageous, a great artist, a world figure, etc., etc., and she was as generous as the day is long. In order to suit the ambitions of Bennett and later the WCPM, Cather couldn't be a lesbian. In order for some Cather family members to support the WCPM financially, Cather couldn't be a lesbian. Of course, she was. And the National Willa Cather Center no longer shies away from her life, although not all readers are willing to go along with the shift. At a recent book talk at my local public library, commemorating the 150th anniversary of Cather's birth, one audience member insisted that I should focus on Cather's wealth and generosity, while another told me that Cather's books were great and that we should all just read them rather than talk about what goes on in the bedroom. They were on the same page as L.V. Jacks in 1949. In Cold War Nebraska, the lesbian author who lived in New York City with her female partner when she wrote My Antonia was not suitable as the public face of her memorial. Instead, Annie Sadilek-Pavelka, the prototype of the novel's immigrant pioneer protagonist, took the center stage, even her life slightly sanitized so she could assume that role. Thanks.
Okay. Melissa, you're probably expecting this question from me. So I'm fascinated by the framing of this place as the Willa Cather Pioneer. It's Pioneer Museum, right?
It's a memorial, but then it was also a museum. But the official name was Willa Cather Pioneer Memorial, but then they had a museum.
So I'm familiar, so you referenced my work on Pioneer Monument statues, which we talked about yesterday. But I'm also familiar with pioneer museums that are intended to serve memorial purposes. I'm interested in knowing sort of what the thrust of that place was at that time, right? So you mentioned that there's this wide range of stuff. I guess I get we're reproducing her novels as well as things that connected with the author, but then the taxidermy, it stands out, right? But I'm familiar with the Pioneer Woman Museum in Ponca City, Oklahoma is the one that comes to mind for me, which was a museum that was constructed in the 1950s to accompany a 1930s well-known monument, statuary monument. And it sort of became, where you gave all of your things out of your attic, right? But especially things that people associated with pioneer mothers. So
Right.
Quilting and spinning and so forth, which was probably not really used on the frontier, but everybody thought that it was. So anyway, I'm interested in hearing whether there's a framing of this pioneer memorial as, are they telling these kinds of pioneer mythologies associated with it? Are there things associated with pioneer womanhood coming out of her novels, or is it really just anything that anybody had in their attic that was old and Nebraskan?
The documentation of that early period is extremely sparse. There are those photographs, there are a few documents, there are some newspaper articles. So it really is kind of a mystery, and even accession records for genuine Cather-related materials, there's just nothing, right? So I'm Tracy Tucker, who is the archivist, and I forget what her title is now, but anyway, she has a sense that some of the way that it played out in the 1950s had to do with, I'm sorry about holding my hand up, but this light is kind of, there was a sort of competing effort to put together sort of a local history collection, and so they sort of took that on. The Webster County Museum, I think, was founded later, and then that became the general attic. But in some ways now, the Willa Cather National Willa Cather Center, because it has proper storage conditions and proper ways to take care of objects, has become a local history collection as well for the pioneer era. So it's gone through a bunch of changes, but part of it is just really there's no way to know exactly what they were doing, and I don't think they really knew exactly what they were doing either. It was just very seat of the pants, but certainly Mildred Bennett's ambitions were tied to Willa Cather because that gave people outside of Red Cloud a reason to pay attention, right? So the real local history sort of pioneer museums, I think, were much more local, but Mildred Bennett always had ambitions to bring people from outside. And even, the Willa Cather Spring Conference in some ways now is pretty modest, but they had real national figures come in the 60s and 70s. I don't know how she pulled it off. It's harder to do now than it was then, but she was really bringing people into Red Cloud through Cather, but then there's also the grab bag. So it's kind of a lot of things at once.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. I think the people who know me probably can anticipate the question I'm going to ask or the comment I'm going to make, which is kind of a combination of the two. Your discussion brought back so many memories or thoughts of the Eleanor Roosevelt-Lorena Hickok relationship and the debates over it. And I'm just wondering if you were thinking maybe of that at some point as just kind of a brief comparison. Or what I was thinking of, if you think about it, Eleanor Roosevelt and Willa Cather are really two very famous people of the first half of the 20th century. To have somebody do an exhibit that compares the two and compares the two same-sex relationships and the debates that they had and the debates over them as a way of interrogating the whole topic, knowing of the ingrained conservatism of the presidential library system. I don't think the Roosevelt Library would do it, but I think they should. But maybe, an institution dedicated to LGBTQ plus history would be interesting.
Yeah, so, it's interesting that you mentioned the Eleanor Roosevelt, Lorena Hickok, because there are still people who will say, there's this kind of moving, people will pull out that it was different back then, and they'll move that to wherever they don't want lesbians, right? So, there's just a whole, I'm just tired of that kind of debate. And when you even see it about, you say, well, they talk about hugging and kissing, but that didn't mean, And I would say, why isn't hugging and kissing sex? That's enough for me. We don't have to prove it like LV Jacks did, thought we wanted to. At this point, there's a older lesbian couple who are making a contingent gift to the National Willa Cather Center that they want more Edith Lewis at the center, which it wasn't Edith Lewis's place. I don't care if there's an Edith Lewis exhibit, and Edith Lewis did not at all cooperate with the founding of that institution because she thought it was something that Willa Cather would not want, which is absolutely right. That Cather didn't know Bennett. Cather would not have wanted that memorial, which is not at all a critique of the organization now on which I serve on the board, right? But, that I don't think that the National Willa Cather Center has to become that. Certainly not a place for that relationship, which isn't really related to that place, so.
Melissa, could I just ask a clarifying question? So
Yes.
That discussion in the letter about Lewis's behavior or attitude, is that what it's about? That she's just not cooperating?
Yes. There is a moment that Bennett goes back to multiple times in published and unpublished statements when she goes to New York and she meets with Edith Lewis, and Edith Lewis does not want to cooperate with her book. And she just really conceives a hatred for Edith Lewis. She becomes obsessed with Edith Lewis as an obstructionist. And there's really no reason that Edith Lewis had to help her. But then Bennett just becomes extremely resentful, and John March, I think, that's why was Edith Lewis such a bitch? Why didn't Edith Lewis support the publication of your book about Willa Cather by Knopf? Well, it was because Edith Lewis was working with an authorized biographer. She did a lot of work for E.K. Brown and paved the way for him to write that book, which then he died before it was finished, and it was completed by Leon Adele. Anyone who knows anything about psychoanalytic criticism, there's a whole story there. So yeah, she just, the resentment, I mean, she felt like Cather belonged to her, and she resented Lewis's sense, which like makes no sense as far as I'm concerned, so yeah.
Melissa, if you could tell us a little bit more about the resources, how many of the letters and other potential sources are housed in Nebraska? And I thought, again, going way back to my days as an undergraduate English major, that there were a collection of resources at the University of Virginia. Am I right about that?
So the Louise Pound letters are at the University of Virginia. And like I said, those were, Louise had been working on the donation before she died, and the arrangements were finalized by her sister Olivia. And those letters then had restrictions on them until the, like, I think late 1970s, early 1980s. And short-term restrictions on letters involving still living people are absolutely ordinary or shortly after their death. People make a big deal about it with Cather. I worked in a rare book and manuscript library in the 1980s. That's just what people do. And then there are other letters that are in a collector's collection, so he bought a lot of materials. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln has by far the most Cather letters, manuscripts, ephemera, books, everything. And then there are a lot of materials. There are some Cather letters in Red Cloud at the National Willa Cather Center. There's Mildred Bennett's papers. There's other papers related to Cather. Then I think the next biggest collection is at the Houghton, because that's where her books were published during the first half of her career, so corresponds with her editors. If anyone wants to read Cather's letters freely online through the complete letters of Willa Cather, there are many ways that you can access them and sort them, including you can sort them by repository alphabetically or by the number. You can look at correspondence. You can look at indexes to works mentioned and people mentioned. So yeah, so now you don't have to do so much of that traveling. But a lot of the materials I'm talking about are not actually Cather letters. Right. So those are different sorts of repositories. So there's a lot of Edith Lewis letters and the Alfred Knopf archive at the Harry Ransom Center. And there are some Cather letters there. But then, yeah, so I know too much about that question. Sorry.
Oh, no, but it's the kind of question, of course, as a historian, I was particularly curious about. And as long as I have the mic, my famous question, to what extent should we be defining Willa Cather as a Midwestern author? And if the answer is yes, what makes her so?
Well, she, even though she lived in Nebraska for a dozen years, she presented herself to the world as a representative of Nebraska culture. So in the 1920s, for example, when The Nation magazine was doing this series of essays, These United States, where they asked a person to write an essay about sort of the history and culture of each state, she was Nebraska. She wrote Nebraska at the end of the first cycle, which is a really fascinating essay for Nebraska history, and it's also available on the Willa Cather archive for free. You can look at her nonfiction, her view of the history of the state. She spent the first, 10 years of her life in Virginia, which doesn't really come forward until her final published novel, which is set in antebellum Virginia and based on family history. And she spent 10 years in Pittsburgh. So, but I still think that there was a sense in which, she subscribed to the local papers, had them mailed through the end of her life. Her parents, until they died, lived there. So I do think that she felt that connection strongly, but it was not her only identity or her only connection to place.
Thank you for this presentation, Melissa. I really enjoyed it. As a fan of Jen Mannion's work, I would love to hear your thoughts about Willa Cather and those histories, and as she transgender, as Mannion said, and those gender nonconforming images, which are just so provocative. But I also think maybe different than some of the folks that Mannion chronicled in her book, or their book.
So, I have some things I can draw on here that I presented in other contexts, which will go towards this. So, as I said, reading Female Husbands, a Trans History, and an Interdisciplinary 19th Century Studies grad seminar on queering the 19th century, I signed it before I read it, which is how I teach grad seminars, right? So one of the things that Mannion does in line with methods developed by trans history, and I'll just read a quotation here. She says, I use the concept of trans as a verb. To say someone transed or was transing gender signifies a process or practice without claiming to understand what it meant to that person or asserting any kind of fixed identity for them. In this way, we might view the subjects of this book, which is assigned female people who presented as male and married women, as traveling through life, establishing an ever-unfolding relationship with gender, rather than viewing them as simply shifting between two unchanging binaries. Examining lives unfolding over time, we can consider how circumstance, age, or prior experiences with gender influence their present and future decisions, as well as how others perceive these changes. So I think the basic thing that I have come to understand, and also not entirely a joke, but also when that question came up when I was writing my book, it's like, that was before she met Edith Lewis, so I don't care, right? But I did, but I wasn't really grappling with it. But I think the answer is that Cather in adolescence transgender. It didn't require a particular costume. The hair, I think, and the name William was certainly enough. But I think also, but then stopped, right? So that practice, Cather practiced transing and then ceased practicing transing and presented to the world as a woman. But I think that something that Edith Lewis says in her memoir of Cather, so she says, let me see if I can find this. Perhaps because she was more fearless, less inhibited than the generality of young people, perhaps also because her own family, with a broader tradition than many Red Cloud households, looked with tolerance on her proceedings, she did not shrink from it, maybe rather enjoyed challenging public opinion. She wore her hair cut short in a period when this itself was a mark of a rebel. She dressed as much as possible like her brothers. And I think that the clothing is as much as possible within her family structure and in that time period, but also that she lived that, and that, I think that's a sort of a remarkable thing, that she did live a kind of trans life as an adolescent in Red Cloud. But I think continuing that and assuming full masculine attire would have required a separation from family and moving away and becoming somebody someplace else, right? So I don't think that that's a place that Cather went. And so there's just sort of the break, and then presenting more as conventionally feminine and living as a woman. But there's that sort of experience that's still there. And I don't at all invalidate that experience or say that it wasn't real. I think that's one interpretation. But I think even Jen Mannion, so a lot of the figures in Mannion's book are actually in Surpassing the Love of Men by Lillian Faderman as lesbians, right? Who were dressed as men to gain sexual access to women. And I think that, those possibilities are all in play. I wouldn't shut any of them down.
Sorry, I don't mean to dominate the microphone, so others please ask questions. But just to follow up on what you were just saying, I'm hearing resonances to something. Susan Lee Johnson's recent book, Writing Kit Carson, which I don't know if you've encountered this book, but so she's talking about two women who were writing biographies of Kit Carson in the post-war period, 50s, 60s, 70s, I think. And Susan Johnson's unpacking queerness in these people's, these two female identifying authors' early life. And in the same time period, she has strikingly similar images of portraits of theatrical productions that they were in which they were crossing gender lines in the roles that they're playing. So anyway, it might be interesting for you to look the last section of that book, if you're interested in thinking about this earlier period, and the ways in which people are constructing gender identities and sexualities in the 19 teens and 20s. Interesting resonance,
Yeah.
maybe.
I mean, so Cather, the trouser pictures are roles. There's no indication that, and I don't know whether Cather could have gotten away with it, wearing trousers in addition to the haircut in William, right? So that's on stage, the trousers appear. And even later, she presents as a fairly conventional woman. The only pictures of her in pants, they're when she's out in the Southwest climbing around in Mesa Verde, and when she and Edith Lewis are hiking around Grand Manan Island. Otherwise, there are pictures of her hiking in skirts too, right? So she actually becomes, and she shops at Maison Schiaparelli in Paris in 1936, right? So she's kind of into fashion at that point, but yeah, the earlier period, different, inhabits gender very differently.
Oh, and if I may, a quick question following up on what Kathy was asking about archives. You mentioned, I don't remember whose writing it was, that was in the Duke Special Collections Library at Duke University.
Duke.
I think you said there was
sorry,
something
Duke and
at
UVA.
Duke.
Right.
And I was just curious whether that was in the gender, because they have a strong gender
No.
sexuality collection, or if this just happened to be at the same archive.
It just, the Pound, I think I misspoke when I put the Pound letters at Virginia a minute ago, but at Duke, there isn't much at Duke, but there are those letters. Yeah, and that donation happened in the 1950s, so I think it has nothing in particular to do with the Sally Bingham collection, but no. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. I have, I guess, two questions. One is, I'm curious about the reception of the Bennett and Brown books at the time that they were published. And then secondly, I'm curious about the current moment.
What moment?
The current moment.
Current moment.
And in particular, how it is that your organization is sort of navigating the rough political terrain around a lot of these issues, especially in Nebraska right now. So.
One of the congressional districts, then it's not an issue, right? Yes.
I think that, like I said, the organization, in which I'm on the board, but I'm not really sort of in leadership, but Ashley Olson, who is the current director, and Tracy Tucker and Rachel Olson, who are sort of the two people doing a lot of the operational work on education and the archives, they're just like, yeah, she was a lesbian, just, get over it. But they also, there has been a long history. Like, I can't, all the times that I have heard things, all the years that I've toured, explaining away Cather's adolescent gender nonconformity, for instance. Yeah. Not really. I told this. Well, I won't tell this story since we're live streaming. I can tell you a story about something later that involves a current politician representing Nebraska. But no, I mean, so far, I mean, they've gotten, they got the sort of like COVID infrastructure grants. They've gotten, I mean, they have managed it, but yeah, I mean, that's always a threat, right? And I certainly, as a lesbian living in Nebraska, am very much aware of the potential threat still looming, but at this point, no, it hasn't really been an issue.
Melissa, I wonder if you wanted to take the opportunity to talk about recent scholarly books on Cather that are kind of continuing the kind of the position that we can't know.
Oh man, Benjamin Taylor's Chasing Bright Medusas, supposedly a biography, a trade biography. Most recently I found out that he's a gay man, and my head just really he does this sort of mystery we can't know, and totally misrepresents the letters that he quotes and really did know research. Yeah, so that book has gotten a lot of press, and the notion that, like, he's a particularly nuanced interpreter of the question of Cather's sexuality. No. I mean, he didn't read my book, and he had time to read it. I mean, even there's a whole mythology around Cather and Lewis's graves, this idea that Lewis was buried at Cather's feet. He ends the book with that, and I end my book, explaining exactly what happened with the gravesite and how that misrepresentation came about. Now, Lewis is buried at Cather's side. She didn't want to mark her. There's a whole, I have a whole theory about why that is. And, he didn't even know that, I've just, it's a book about the relationship, but it's also pretty drastically new about Cather biography. I discovered she had breast cancer. That had totally, so people had this idea that there's some sort of secret and Edith Lewis is hiding something. It was Cather's breast cancer, and it had metastasized to her liver at the time of her death, and it probably had metastasized to her brain, which was the source of the cerebral hemorrhage that killed her. I ended up finding that out because I happened to meet the granddaughter of her breast surgeon, who said, well, she must have had breast cancer, and I was like, no. And then the death certificates had just become public. New York State, I think, had a 70-year or whatever, and I ordered the death certificate, and that's when I found, who pronounced, and so it all sort of came together. But yeah, there's just still, which is all to say that there's a lot more even beyond my research to know about Cather, but there is a way that earlier understandings, new evidence is held up against the earlier understandings rather than the earlier understandings held up against the new evidence, right? And people who are historians, you could understand that. So you say, Cather was extremely private. Well, no, she really wasn't all that private. In the end of her life, she was private because she was ill, and she was old, and she was just really conserving her energy and trying not to traumatize family members with knowledge of her illness, right? That's clearly what was going on, but people then still keep repeating. And the stories about letter burning, for example, are another kind of story that is held up to sort of like Cather was hiding something. And, it really, very limited examples, and the whole logic of it, you see those claims and there's never a footnote telling you why. We supposedly know that because there's no source, so.
Yes, well, thank you, Melissa. That was a wonderful talk. And eat the snacks. And we're back in here at 11 for the next session.
What are we gonna put on the screen?
LGBTQ plus Midwesterners in urban, rural, and small town settings.
What do we want?
Enjoy the food. I don't want any leftovers.